The rain came down in sheets, so heavy that it blurred the headlights of Richard's sleek, silver car. He gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white as he navigated the empty road. He was no stranger to storms, but tonight's was different, raw, unforgiving, and wild. It seemed to echo something deep within him, a restlessness that had taken root in his soul years ago. The world outside his luxury vehicle appeared distant, a cold blur of gray and silver. The storm had emptied the streets, leaving him alone with his thoughts, but they weren't thoughts of peace. Richard had built his empire with sheer determination, but at the cost of his peace of mind. His fortune had grown with each passing year, but somewhere along the way, he'd lost the joy of living. It was as if success had become a shield, a barrier that kept him from truly connecting with anything or anyone. As he drove, he thought back to the countless meetings, the endless stream of business deals, and the high-powered events that seemed to fill his days. He had everything, a mansion in the hills, expensive cars, tailor-made suits. But lately, he couldn't shake the feeling that his life had become a hollow shell, one that existed only to maintain the illusion of success. He longed for something real, something that would stir his soul again, but in the fog of wealth and power, that was hard to find. And then, through the downpour, he saw her. At first, Richard thought his eyes were playing tricks on him. There, on the side of the road, illuminated only by the faint glow of his headlights, stood a woman. She was drenched to the bone, her dark hair clinging to her face, her clothes soaked through, but it wasn't just the rain that caught his attention. It was her posture, her shoulders slumped in defeat, her head down, her arms wrapped around two small children standing beside her. The twins were barely 5 years old, their little faces pale from the cold, their small bodies trembling in the storm. Richard's instincts screamed at him to drive on. He was in a hurry, headed to yet another high-society dinner, a room full of people he barely knew but whose approval he constantly craved. Yet, as he glanced at the woman and her children, something inside him stirred. He didn't know what it was, a mix of pity, curiosity, and something deeper, something he couldn't quite name. But he didn't drive on. Instead, he slowed the car and pulled to the side of the road. The woman didn't look up at him as he rolled down the window. Her gaze remained fixed on the ground, her face hidden by her wet hair. Richard felt a pang of uncertainty. Was this some kind of trap? A scam? His mind tried to reason it out, but then, one of the twins, a little boy with wide eyes, looked up at him. The child's eyes were filled with such sorrow, such innocence, that Richard felt his breath catch in his throat. The boy said nothing, but his expression spoke volumes. He was scared, cold, and helpless. Richard didn't know what to say to that. He had no answers for her, no grand gestures of help to offer. But in that moment, he realized something: he had stopped to help. And that, in itself, was something he had forgotten how to do. Richard's car slowed to a crawl as he approached the figure standing in the rain. The windshield wipers swept back and forth frantically, but they couldn't clear away the image that had lodged itself in his mind. A woman, soaked to the bone, stood alone at the edge of the street. Her shoulders were hunched against the downpour, her face obscured by the dark strands of wet hair that clung to her skin. But it wasn't just the rain that made her look fragile, it was the way she clutched two small children to her chest. Twins, no older than 5, their tiny bodies pressed against her, their faces pale, shivering in the chill of the storm. Richard's heart tightened in his chest. There was something so raw, so desperate about the scene before him. The woman's eyes, he could see them now, wide with a mixture of fear and exhaustion, seemed to cut through the heavy rain and the noise of the storm, locking onto his car with a silent plea. It wasn't a request for money. It wasn't a plea for charity. It was something deeper, something he couldn't quite place. But it made him feel uncomfortable, as though he had been caught in a moment that was far too intimate for his world of suits and business lunches. He pressed the brakes and rolled the window down, the cool air rushing in. The woman didn't move at first, still standing there, her children holding on to her like lifelines. The street was empty, the only sound the steady rhythm of the rain against the pavement and the occasional car that passed by in the distance. For a long, breathless moment, nothing happened. Then, finally, the woman stepped toward the car. Her clothes clung to her skin, drenched and heavy, but it was the look in her eyes that pulled Richard in. There was nothing desperate about her, at least, not in the way one might expect. Instead, there was a quiet strength, a mother's strength, in her gaze that made Richard feel small, as though his wealth and power meant nothing in this raw, vulnerable moment. "Can I help you?" Richard asked, his voice softer than he intended. The woman hesitated, looking at him with a kind of wariness, as if she had already been disappointed too many times. But then she nodded, her lips trembling. "My name's Nora," she said, her voice strained, almost hoarse. "These are my twins, Luca and Lily." She gestured toward the two small children, who, despite the cold, clung to her sides like shadows. They looked up at Richard with wide, uncertain eyes. "Are you okay?" Richard's words felt hollow, but they were all he could manage. He couldn't help but feel that something was off. Why was she standing in the rain with children in the middle of the night? Nora nodded, though the gesture didn't seem entirely convincing. "I'm trying to get home," she said, her voice barely audible above the storm. "But I don't have the money for a bus. And the shelters," she trailed off, shaking her head as if the words were too heavy to say aloud. "I can't go there. Not with them." Richard's brow furrowed as he processed her words. Something about her was different from the usual people who might ask for help. There was no begging, no hint of manipulation. Just a quiet exhaustion, a mother's struggle laid bare in the middle of a storm. His mind raced. He had seen people like her before, those who had fallen through the cracks, who had been left behind by society, forgotten in the face of the fast-moving world Richard inhabited. But Nora wasn't just another face in the crowd. Her eyes, her tired yet determined eyes, stirred something inside him that he hadn't felt in a long time. "How long have you been out here?" Richard asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. "Hours," she replied, her voice thick with fatigue. "I thought I could make it, but the storm," her words trailed off as she wiped a hand across her forehead, brushing away the rainwater. "I don't know where to turn anymore. I just want to get them home. They're tired. They're cold." Richard glanced at the twins, their faces pale, eyes downcast. They didn't cry, they didn't make a sound. They simply stood there, clinging to their mother as if the world outside no longer existed. "Where's home?" he asked, genuinely curious. Nora looked at him then, a flicker of hope crossing her face, but it quickly faded. "I wish I knew," she said quietly. "It used to be a small apartment, just a little place on the edge of town. But then, everything fell apart. I lost my job. My husband left. And now," she swallowed hard, the pain evident in her eyes. "Now I'm just trying to make sure they don't end up like me." Richard felt a pang in his chest. It was the way she said it, the way she carried that weight, like she wasn't just trying to survive for herself, but for her children, too. It was a weight he couldn't begin to understand. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The rain continued to fall in thick sheets, drenching everything in sight. The world felt like it had slowed down, as if time itself had paused for a brief moment to let them share this quiet, desperate truth. "I don't have much," Richard said finally, his voice softer than before. "But I can give you a ride if you want. At least get you out of the rain." But for the first time in years, Richard felt as if he was exactly where he needed to be. Richard wasn't sure what made him stop. Maybe it was the way the woman's eyes held him, or perhaps it was the quiet desperation in her posture. His life had taught him to ignore the small, uncomfortable moments, to keep his focus on the bigger picture, the deals, the acquisitions, the money. But tonight was different. The rawness of the moment cut through him in a way that made his usual defenses crumble. With a sigh, he shifted his car into park and stepped out into the torrential rain, the cold water soaking through his shoes immediately. The woman didn't speak at first, just stood there, as though waiting for something. Her twins were silent, their small hands clutching her legs, their eyes wide with confusion and fear. Richard's heart tightened, but it wasn't pity he felt, it was something deeper, a gnawing sense of responsibility. He knew he could do something. But what? He wasn't a social worker. He wasn't someone who went around helping strangers on street corners. I can help, Richard said, the words feeling foreign on his tongue. The woman blinked as though his words had caught her off guard, but then she stepped forward, her movements stiff and weary. She held out her hand. I'm Nora, she said quietly. Her voice trembled as she spoke, the weight of her situation clear in her every word. These are my twins, Lucas and Lily. Richard nodded, glancing down at the children. The little boy clung to his mother's leg, and the girl, though equally soaked, seemed to have a protective energy about her, her face a mask of quiet strength that reminded Richard of the way he used to be when he was younger, before the world wore him down. Are you all right? Richard asked, his tone softer now, the edge of impatience he usually carried with him fading as he took in her appearance. Her clothes were threadbare, and her face looked drawn, exhausted. No, Nora replied, her voice barely a whisper. I don't think I am. She paused, as if deciding whether or not to say more. Richard waited, his mind racing, trying to understand what had brought her to this point. I used to have a job, she continued, her gaze downcast. I worked as a cashier at a grocery store. But then, things changed. The store closed, and I couldn't find work after that. My husband, well, he left. He didn't want to be a father anymore. I don't know how to keep going. I don't know how to give my children a future. The words hung heavy in the air between them, each one falling like a stone into a quiet pond. Richard found himself struggling to find something to say. His world, built on business deals and corporate jargon, didn't have room for this kind of pain, this kind of hopelessness. I don't know what to do, Nora said, her voice breaking as she pulled her children closer to her, as if to shield them from the storm, or perhaps from the world itself. I don't know where to go. I've been trying to find a place, but everything's too expensive, and I can't make enough. My twins, they need more than I can give them. Richard's chest tightened. He had heard stories like this before, of course, on the news, in charity events, or in interviews, but this was different. This wasn't some faceless statistic. This was Nora, a woman standing in front of him, her children shivering in the rain. For a moment, Richard felt completely out of his depth. He wasn't used to feeling helpless. He was used to having control, to being the one who made things happen. But here, in this storm-soaked moment, he realized that no amount of money could fix the pain that Nora and her children were carrying. His mind raced for a solution, anything to make this situation right, but the truth was, he didn't have the answers. He wasn't a savior. He was just a man who had worked hard to build a life for himself, and now he found himself face to face with a reality he couldn't ignore. I don't know what to say, Richard confessed, his voice low, almost apologetic. Nora looked up at him, her eyes wide with a mixture of disbelief and something else, a quiet kind of acceptance, as if she didn't expect him to have all the answers, but was willing to accept whatever he could offer. You're the first person to stop, she said softly. Most people just drive by. I don't know why you're here, but I'm grateful you are. Her words struck him deeper than any financial transaction ever had. For the first time in years, Richard felt a flicker of something unfamiliar, a sense of vulnerability, of genuine connection. He wasn't sure what this moment meant, but he knew it was significant. I'll help, he said, the words coming easier now, more certain. We'll figure something out. And in that instant, Richard realized that perhaps he wasn't here to fix her problems, but to see them, truly see them, and to make a choice. A choice to not walk away, to not turn his back. In that quiet, stormy night, something shifted within him. Maybe it was the rain. Maybe it was the vulnerability in Nora's eyes. Or maybe, just maybe, it was the recognition of his own humanity that had been buried under the weight of his success for far too long. Let's get you and the kids somewhere warm, Richard said, offering her his hand. As Nora looked at him, a fragile, uncertain hope bloomed in her eyes. And in that moment, Richard's world began to change. Richard was quiet for a long moment as he processed what he'd just heard. Nora, Lucas, and Lily. The name sat heavy in the air, contrasting sharply with the cold downpour that continued to soak them all. He could feel the weight of their circumstances, and it pressed against him, almost suffocating him in its darkness. He had to remind himself that he wasn't here to play the hero, that he had no obligation to help beyond his own decision to stop in the first place. But deep down, he knew that wasn't true. He had chosen to stop for a reason, even if he couldn't yet articulate why. Nora's eyes, however, told him everything he needed to know. Her voice, once trembling, had gained a quiet strength. She had likely carried this burden alone for longer than Richard could fathom. And as he stood there, his expensive suit now drenched in the rain, the distinction between their worlds seemed so clear, so pronounced. His life, so carefully constructed and maintained, had afforded him luxuries he never truly needed. But this woman, standing in the storm with nothing but the clothes on her back, had everything she needed right there, her children. Lucas and Lily, their small faces still hidden beneath the heavy weight of the storm, had no idea what was about to happen, nor did they know how their mother had fought to keep them safe for so long. Richard took a step closer, his shoes sloshing in the puddles beneath him. "How long have you been out here?" he asked softly, his voice barely audible over the storm. He had to shout to make himself heard, but his tone carried an unspoken sincerity, one that Nora could sense. She hesitated for a moment, glancing down at her children as if weighing how much to reveal. "I don't even know anymore," she said finally, her voice cracking. I just wanted to find somewhere safe. Somewhere to rest. But everything seems out of reach. It's hard to think clearly when your world feels like it's falling apart." Her words hung in the air, their weight sinking in deep. Richard shifted uncomfortably, feeling an unfamiliar knot forming in his stomach. He was used to problems that could be solved with money or influence. A bad quarter? Fix it with a new contract. A financial setback? He knew how to navigate that. But this wasn't a problem money could solve. There were no quick fixes for the depths of despair in Nora's voice. She wasn't asking for a handout. She wasn't even asking for help in the way he was used to. No, what she was doing was far more difficult. She was trusting him, however tentatively, with the hardest thing she had, her pain. "Why don't you get in the car?" Richard offered gently, glancing at her children. "We can get out of this rain. I can take you somewhere safe." Nora's eyes darted to the car and back to him, hesitation flickering in her expression. Richard could see that trust wasn't something easily earned for her. It wasn't just the rain that had made her wary, it was life itself, the unrelenting hardships she had faced alone. He didn't expect her to leap at his offer. He wasn't even sure why he'd made it. He could have easily driven away, returned to the comfort of his life, and told himself it was none of his business. But the pull he felt toward her, toward this moment, was something he couldn't ignore. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Nora nodded. Her voice, though soft, carried a sense of weary resolve. "Thank you," she whispered. "I don't know what else to do. I've been trying to make it work. I've tried to find a place to stay, to get a job, but it's not working. I'm not asking for charity, she paused, her lips quivering for a brief moment before she forced herself to continue. "I just need a chance. A chance for my kids." Richard felt a pang in his chest as he listened to her. Her words weren't just a plea for help, they were a cry for hope. And something in him stirred, something deep inside that he hadn't felt in a long time. He wasn't sure what had caused the change in him. Was it the raw honesty of her words? Or the realization that, in this very moment, he was witnessing a mother's struggle to do whatever it took to survive for her children? "Let's get you all out of the rain," Richard said, his voice firm but kind. He opened the back door of the car, letting Nora slide in first, the twins following her closely, their small hands clutching her legs tightly. As the car door closed behind them, Richard hesitated for a moment, standing in the rain as if something inside him was still trying to make sense of the situation. But the moment of uncertainty passed quickly, swallowed by the quiet hum of the engine starting up. As he pulled away from the curb, heading toward the shelter of his home, Richard glanced into the rearview mirror, catching a glimpse of Nora as she whispered something to her children. Lucas and Lily, their faces now sheltered from the rain, were watching her closely, as if trying to understand what had just happened, what was going to happen next. But for now, they were safe, and for the first time in a long while, Richard felt like he might be doing something right. He wasn't sure what would happen next, or how he could help her in any meaningful way, but one thing was certain, this night had changed something inside him. For the first time in a long time, Richard had stepped outside of his world, outside of his comfort zone, to witness a life that had been stripped down to its rawest, most vulnerable form. And it made him question everything he had ever believed about success, about wealth, and about what it meant to truly be alive. Nora hesitated before answering, her eyes flicking down to the ground as if searching for the right words in the wet pavement beneath her feet. For a moment, she seemed to shrink under the weight of her own memories, the kind of memories Richard had never allowed himself to fully understand, memories shaped by struggle, fear, and resilience in equal measure. He felt the awkward silence stretch between them, the sound of the rain the only thing filling the void. It was then that he realized that despite his wealth, despite his position in the world, there were vast territories of life that he had never had to navigate. In many ways, the world he inhabited had been an insular one, crafted carefully and deliberately to avoid anything that could challenge his sense of control. But standing here in the cold, with this woman and her children, he felt exposed, vulnerable in a way that made his skin crawl. "We've been living in shelters for the past few weeks," Nora finally said, her voice soft but steady now, the words slipping out as though they had been waiting to be spoken. I used to have a job, you know? I was a manager at a local grocery store. But when the store shut down, everything started falling apart." She paused, her gaze lifting to meet his for the first time since they'd started speaking. There was no anger in her eyes, no bitterness, just the quiet resignation of someone who had fought hard for what little they had left. "My ex left me when I was 6 months pregnant. Said he couldn't handle the responsibility. And since then, it's been a constant battle, just to keep food on the table. Then the shelter ran out of space, and we had no choice but to stay outside tonight. I don't know where we're going to go from here." Richard stood still, frozen, his mind racing. He had heard similar stories before, of course, stories of hardship, poverty, broken families. But they had always been distant tales, things that seemed to happen to other people, people who were so far removed from his world that he could ignore them without a second thought. But now, standing in the rain with Nora and her twins, the weight of her words felt as if they were pressing directly on his chest, suffocating him. He wasn't sure what to do with that feeling, the guilt, the sadness, the overwhelming sense of helplessness. "Why didn't you ask for help?" Richard found himself asking, his voice distant, as though it belonged to someone else. "There must be programs, places you can go for support. People who can help." Nora gave a small, humorless laugh, the sound barely audible over the rain. "I've asked. I've begged. But sometimes, it's just not enough. The system doesn't have the resources, and the people who can help are too busy to notice someone like me. I've learned to survive without waiting for someone else to fix things. But some days, I feel like I'm drowning." She looked down at her twins then, her eyes softening as she gently brushed wet strands of hair from Lucas's face. "I'll keep trying, though. For them." Richard didn't know what to say to that. He wanted to speak, to offer her some solution, but the words felt hollow, meaningless. How could he understand what she was going through? How could he possibly comprehend the endless cycle of survival she had been locked in? The luxury of choice, the comfort of always knowing there was a way forward, those things didn't exist in her world, and yet, here he was, a man who could afford anything, trying to find some way to help, some way to make it better. Finally, Richard spoke, his voice quieter this time. "You shouldn't have to do this alone. I know that it's not much, but, if you want, I can help you get back on your feet. Maybe I can connect you with someone who can offer more long-term support." Nora's gaze lifted to his once again, this time sharper, more wary. She studied him for a long moment, as if weighing the sincerity of his words, or perhaps even questioning his motives. Richard didn't blame her for the hesitation. Trust didn't come easily to people who had been let down repeatedly, who had learned to rely only on themselves. "I'm not asking for charity," she said finally, her voice firm. "I don't want handouts. I want a chance to stand on my own again. For me, and for my kids. That's all." Richard felt a pang in his chest. She wasn't asking for pity. She wasn't looking for a knight in shining armor to sweep in and solve all her problems. She just wanted what so many people took for granted, a chance to rebuild, to have a fair shot at a better life. The realization was a blow to him, a humbling moment that forced him to reevaluate everything he thought he knew about success, about power, and about the true meaning of help. "I understand," he said quietly. "And I can help you with that. We'll figure something out. You don't have to do this alone anymore." Nora didn't say anything for a long moment, and Richard couldn't tell if she was skeptical or simply overwhelmed. But then, she nodded slowly, a faint, uncertain smile playing at the corners of her lips. "Thank you," she said. "Maybe this is the beginning of something better. For all of us." In that moment, Richard felt something shift within him, something he hadn't felt in years. A spark of hope, of connection, of the possibility that maybe, just maybe, he wasn't as far removed from the world around him as he had once thought. And for the first time in a long while, he felt like he was part of something that truly mattered. The words hung in the air, and Richard could feel the weight of them settle over him like an invisible burden. Nora's eyes drifted back down to her children, who had been eerily silent, watching their mother with wide eyes. It was as if they understood that this conversation, despite the rain, was something important. Richard could feel his chest tighten as he processed what she had just shared. Her ex had left her alone, abandoned her when she needed support the most. "My mother passed away last year," Nora continued, her voice quivering but steady. "She was my only family. We were supposed to be a team. But after she was gone, I had no one. No one to help with the twins, no one to turn to when I needed a shoulder. I've been on my own ever since." She stopped, and Richard could see the pain flicker across her face. I never thought it would be this hard. I thought I could make it. But the bills kept coming. The rent. Food. Things I thought I could manage suddenly felt like mountains, and I couldn't climb them anymore." Richard stood there, unable to find the right words to offer her. What could he say to someone who had lived in a world so far removed from his own? In his world, problems were solved with a well-placed phone call or the stroke of a pen. If he had a problem, money was the solution, always. But for Nora, there were no easy answers, no quick fixes. Her world was one where hope was in short supply, and every step forward seemed to lead to 2 steps back. He took a breath, trying to clear his mind of the fog of guilt that had settled in. He had done well for himself. Too well, in fact. He had money, resources, and connections, everything he needed to solve any problem. But here, in this moment, he realized that all his wealth had amounted to nothing in the face of true hardship. He had lived in a bubble, protected from the rawness of life by his success. And now, standing in front of this woman and her children, he felt utterly helpless. "What happened after you lost your job?" Richard asked, his voice gentler now, as though he too were seeking answers in her story. Nora's eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and frustration. She wiped her hand across her face, brushing away the rainwater that clung to her skin, though it did nothing to erase the exhaustion in her expression. "I tried. I really did. I applied for jobs. But no one wanted to hire someone who's been out of work for months. And the twins, they need me. They can't stay in a daycare while I work. They need me with them, Richard. Every day, they look to me for everything. And I have to keep going, even when I don't have the strength to get out of bed some mornings. Richard took a long, steadying breath, trying to wrap his mind around her words. His world had always been about deadlines, profits, and power moves. But Nora's world was about survival. It was about scraping together enough to feed her kids, keeping them safe, and never giving up, no matter how heavy the weight. For the first time in a long while, Richard felt a sense of guilt that wasn't easily shaken off. He had so much, and yet, it had always been too easy for him to forget how fleeting his comforts could be. In the face of real hardship, all his accomplishments felt meaningless, a mere distraction from what truly mattered. He wanted to do something, anything, to help her, but he didn't know where to start. He had the resources, the connections, but how could he offer them in a way that would truly make a difference in her life? How could he possibly understand what it would mean to be in her shoes? For a long time, there had been a part of him that was blind to the struggles of others. He had built his life by stepping over obstacles, focusing solely on his own rise. The people around him, his colleagues, his friends, his employees, were all part of the system that he controlled. But Nora wasn't part of that system. She was part of a world that was broken in ways he hadn't even begun to comprehend. And standing there in the rain, watching her battle for her family, Richard realized just how much he had taken for granted. "Maybe I can help," Richard said slowly, though he wasn't entirely sure what he meant. "I don't know how, but maybe we can figure something out. A place for you and the twins. Somewhere safe." Nora looked at him, her expression unreadable for a moment. Then, finally, she nodded, though her eyes still held a mixture of disbelief and hope. "Thank you," she whispered. "You don't know what that means." Richard nodded, but inside, he was grappling with something he hadn't expected, the growing sense that his life was about to change in ways he hadn't imagined. What started as an unexpected encounter had now become something more, a pivotal moment that would force him to confront the person he had become. The rain had stopped by the time they reached Richard's home, but the world still felt damp, heavy with the weight of the storm that had passed. The city lights reflected off the wet pavement as Richard pulled into the long driveway of his estate. It was a stark contrast to where Nora and her children had been just hours before, cold, hungry, and drenched in despair. Now, they sat in the warmth of his luxury car, surrounded by the quiet hum of security gates and manicured hedges. Nora hesitated before stepping out. She clutched Lily and Lucas's hands tightly, her body tense, as if she were bracing herself for disappointment. It was a feeling Richard could recognize, though he had never felt it himself. He had seen it in others before, the hesitation that came from years of being let down, of promises being made and broken. Richard opened his mouth to reassure her, but for once, he didn't know what to say. What was he supposed to tell her? That she could trust him? That this wasn't charity, but something deeper? He wasn't even sure he understood his own actions. Why had he brought them here? Was it pity? Was it guilt? Or was it something else, something unspoken, something he had buried beneath years of wealth and comfort? The front doors opened before he could find an answer. A woman in her late 50s, dressed in a simple yet elegant blouse and skirt, stepped out, her face lined with concern. Margaret had been. Nora gave a small nod. "More than I have been in a long time," she admitted. Richard hesitated before speaking again. "I want to help," he said finally. "Not just for tonight, but moving forward. You said you don't want charity, and I respect that. So, what if I offered you something different? A fresh start." Nora's brows furrowed. "What do you mean?" He leaned against the doorframe, folding his arms. "I own a few businesses. Some of them are looking for good people. Steady work, benefits, a real chance to build something again." He paused, studying her reaction. "You don't have to say yes. But I want you to think about it." Nora blinked, her lips parting slightly as she processed his words. "You'd do that?" she asked softly. Richard nodded. "Everyone deserves a second chance. and besides, he glanced toward the children, who were now curled up on the bed, fast asleep. They deserve stability. A real home. Nora looked at him for a long time, her expression unreadable. Then, slowly, she smiled, not a forced or guarded smile, but a real one, something warm and genuine. "Thank you," she whispered, and this time, Richard knew that the words weren't just gratitude for a place to stay. They were something deeper, an acknowledgement that, for the first time in a long while, she wasn't alone. Richard gave her a small nod and stepped back, letting her close the door. As he walked away, he felt something settle inside him. This wasn't about charity. This wasn't about guilt. This was about doing what was right. And for the first time in a long while, he felt like he was exactly where he needed to be. Richard sat alone in his study, staring at the untouched glass of whiskey on the table in front of him. The amber liquid reflected the dim glow of the fireplace, casting fractured golden hues onto the polished wood. He should have felt triumphant, proud even, for what he had done. But instead, he felt something else, something foreign, something he hadn't let himself feel in a long time. Peace. For years, his life had been a blur of deals, investments, and high-stakes negotiations. He had prided himself on being a man of logic, someone who made decisions based on numbers and probabilities, never emotion. And yet, here he was, standing at the crossroads of something he never expected, human connection. Nora had been in the house for a week now. 7 days. 7 days of watching her slowly let go of the constant fear she had carried, watching the twins grow more comfortable, more alive. In the beginning, they were timid, careful with their words, as if they feared waking up to find this was all just a dream. But as the days passed, Richard had noticed the small shifts, the way Lucas started running down the hallways, the way Lily's laughter filled the house like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. And Nora, she had changed too. At first, she had been cautious, as if expecting the world to take something from her again. But gradually, she softened. She had taken his job offer, an entry-level position at one of his smaller businesses. It wasn't glamorous, but it was hers, a chance to rebuild without feeling like a burden. She was eager, determined to prove to herself that she could stand on her own again. Richard had never seen someone so grateful for something so simple. He had spent his life surrounded by people who took wealth for granted, who wanted more, no matter how much they already had. But Nora? She didn't want excess. She didn't want luxury. She wanted security. A chance to breathe. And somehow, without realizing it, Richard had become invested in that. A soft knock on the door pulled him from his thoughts. He looked up to see Nora standing there, a hesitant smile on her lips. She looked different now, less fragile, more certain. "Can I come in?" she asked. Richard nodded, gesturing toward the seat across from him. She stepped inside, closing the door behind her. "I just wanted to say thank you," she said quietly, sitting down. Her hands folded together in her lap, her fingers tightening for a moment, before relaxing. "For everything. For giving us a chance." Richard leaned back in his chair, studying her. "You don't need to thank me, Nora. You did the hard part. You kept fighting, even when everything told you to give up." She let out a soft breath, shaking her head. "Maybe. But it's easier to fight when someone believes in you." Silence stretched between them, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was filled with something unspoken, a mutual understanding that didn't need words. "You've changed," she said suddenly, tilting her head as she looked at him. "I don't know if you see it, but I do. The man I met that night, he was different. Cold, maybe. Detached. But now? Now you actually look like someone who's living." Richard chuckled, rubbing his chin. "You make it sound like I was some kind of robot before." She smirked. "Weren't you?" He let out a deep breath, shaking his head. Maybe she was right. Maybe he had been living life on autopilot, chasing numbers and power without ever stopping to consider what it all meant. But now? Now he saw things differently. I don't know what this means for me yet, Richard admitted. But I do know one thing, I don't want to go back to who I was. Nora nodded slowly. Then don't. As simple as the words were, they held weight. He didn't have to go back. He didn't have to return to a world that felt empty. He had a choice. Another moment passed before she stood up. I should get some sleep. The twins are finally sleeping through the night. I don't want to jinx it. Richard smiled. Good night, Nora. She paused at the door, glancing back at him one last time. Good night, Richard. And just like that, she was gone, leaving Richard alone with his thoughts. But this time, for the first time in a long while, the silence didn't feel lonely. It felt full. And that was enough.